Unique people leading unique lives shape and inform Iowa City. This community is enhanced by these women and men who live in our midst, working, teaching, creating. Welcome to a series of conversations with people who have stories to tell. Join my special guests and me, Ellen Buchanan, in a series of interviews called One of a Kind. For 26 years, Himie Voxman served as director of the School of Music at the University of Iowa. His long and distinguished career encompassed teaching and advising over 40 doctoral dissertations, performing on the clarinet, administrating, publishing over 300 editions, articles, and compilations for wind instruments, and co-authoring 4 bibliographies of woodwind literature. Born in Centerville, Iowa, Himie Voxman enrolled at the University of Iowa, where he received a BS degree with high distinction in chemical engineering and an MA degree in psychology of music. His story is intertwined with such notable Iowa City names as William Gower Sr., Ernest Horn, Carl Seashore, Charlie Ebel, and Philip Greeley Clapp. Throughout his career, he has chaired various associations, served on Musical Society's board of directors, and held national offices in music educator associations. He has received citations and awards from many musical societies. The Iowa Bandmasters Association presented him with an honorary life membership, and he was the recipient of the Iowa Music Educators Association's Distinguished Service Award. Professor Voxman received the Bell System Silver Baton and a memorial citation from the American Bandmasters Association. And in 1993, he received the Distinguished Alumni Award from the University of Iowa. He and his wife Lois raised 2 sons in Iowa City, Bill and Jim. And the Voxmans have 4 grandchildren. Welcome, Professor Voxman, to One of a Kind. I know your story begins in Centerville, Iowa, where you were born in September 1912. Tell me a bit about your parents.
My parents were immigrants from Russia. My father came over about 1903, I suppose. It was not unusual sometimes for the father to come over and work 2 or 3 years, and this was the case. And then my mother and 2 children came over later. That's the background.
And you had how many siblings?
I had a brother, 1 brother, and 3 sisters.
There's somebody else that Iowans have heard about from Centerville, Iowa, Simon Estes.
Yes.
Is it true you played marbles with his uncles?
That's right. His uncles were classmates of mine, 3rd, 4th, 5th, third, 4th grade at least, yes. Yes, they were very good friends. Our elementary school was about 2 blocks from where we lived, and we used to play marbles after school with some regularity.
Tell me, how did your musical career start? I read your bio that you were, somebody asked you to play the clarinet, is that right?
No.
No? Nobody asked you to play?
Well, we had a rather ambitious supervisor of music, a lady. She used to annually get lists of students from the teachers in the what we call the grammar school, 7th and 8th grades, of the students that might be prospects for studying an instrument. And she would take those lists to the town band director, and it was up to him. He would go around and see the parents, and would your son or daughter like to study? And that's how I got started. And I think I've mentioned before, had nothing to do with how interested I was in music or what my talents were there. They weren't very much. Music wasn't one of my favorite courses at the lower level. But I did start, and Mr. Gower, that you'll probably say a word about, was my teacher, a very good one.
Now you eventually played for the silent movies.
I did that that was a pastime. The silent movie orchestra, we had quite a good one. It was small, of course, but this was while I was in high school. And they would make a folder up for me, and if I had time after school, I would enter by the back door and sit down and play.
You said music wasn't your first love. It was, you were into
More interested in science, yes.
And the teachers I read gave you quite a bit of responsibility. They even turned over the class to you.
That's right, sometimes, yes. No, I owe a great debt to teachers. Centerville, I think, had a remarkably good group of teachers. We had a superintendent who had the ability to pay very little, but get the devotion and continuity. We were very fortunate, I think, in having the teachers we had. I have the utmost respect for them.
Well, Professor Voxman, tell me now, you started taking the clarinet, and then you were playing when you could after school for the silent movies, but you toured in a band for a summer. Tell me about that.
Well, when I was 15, my teacher, who had played in this kilty band, it was a Scotch band, we wore kilts and everything, he had a call from the band director. He had played in the band before World War I, and the band director was setting up the band again to travel, and he needed some players. He was going to play the Missouri Fair at Bethany, and he said he needed a clarinetist temporarily. This was in the summer, my junior year. I had finished my junior year in high school, so I went there with a couple others and played in the band. We traveled through the Midwest. We'd play grandstand shows for the fairs. Well, at the end of that summer, he said, "I'd like to have you stay on with the band." He said, "I have a fine contract. We'll be the park band in St. Augustine in the winters. And we travel Nova Scotia and the U.S. in the summers." And the pay was remarkably high for those days. I said, "Well, that's fine, but I'd sort of like to get back home and finish my high school career." And he said, "Well, that's good. And just drop me a line in the spring, and I'll tell you where to meet us, and you're welcome to return." Well, unfortunately, that was the year that talking movies came in. And as a result, he wrote me and said that thousands of theater musicians were thrown out of work. And among them were many who had played with the band. And he felt he had a responsibility to those people with families instead of to a 15-year-old boy. So
who hadn't finished high school either.
That's right.
It was kind of a gift, maybe, that happened to you.
Well, I suppose. Otherwise, I might be in St. Augustine today. I don't know.
That's right. So you went back for your senior year in high school.
Yes.
And I read that you were valedictorian of your class and that you took this Westinghouse talent test that out of 25,000 you were tied for number 2, and you were offered a scholarship to Iowa State. Why did you come to Iowa City?
Well, I went to Iowa State, and they were very nice. I met with the head of chemical engineering and some others, but unfortunately, they didn't have a job for me the first semester. They said second semester you can have a job feeding white mice or rats, I don't know which they were. But I frankly didn't have enough money to go for a semester without help. So a friend of mine managed to get me a job working in the quadrangle, so started me off. That didn't last too long because the quadrangle job, the quadrangle cafeteria, was on a lease. The people who had it ran out of money, came uptown where Barbara's Bakery is now, and started another cafeteria, and that went broke in a few months. So I had to rely on my private teaching to keep going.
So after graduation with a chemical engineer, what was the bridge that took you over into music?
Well, as you know, I started teaching immediately when I came to school. Tom Horn was my first student.
And that, for people who've heard of Ernest Horn,
Yes.
that was his son. And
That's
you had
his
some
son.
other students who are Iowa Cityans.
Oh, yes. I had, it's unusual, but some of the names you would know, of course, Bill Meriden, you know, and Pearl West. The Berger boys, both Dick and Warren.
Did you have Chris Schrock?
I had Chris Schrock, yes, he was my bassoonist.
And a John Winery, you told
John Winery, who became a dentist in the course of time. So it's rather nice to walk down the street, you know, and here's my lawyer and Chris, our family doctor. And
You taught him music.
Yes. Albert Sochek, who was our dentist, he was also one of my students in high school.
So you were teaching.
I was teaching privately, yes. And little by little, I had more and more students. And the high school finally gave me a 8th time appointment to come over and teach the high school woodwinds, which I did.
What were you doing the other 7/8 of the time?
Teaching. Just,
Teaching.
privately.
Privately,
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah. Well, the job in the high school got larger and larger as time went on. I think my maximum salary got up to $1,300. And then after I graduated from chemical engineering, there were no jobs. No one in our class got a job that time. And I had a friend, Scott Rieger. I don't know if you know
I
who knew
remember
Nellie
him.
Rieger was.
Audiologist.
Scott, yes, Scott was doing graduate work at the same time I started, except he was ahead of me. And Scott said, well, maybe Dean Seashore might help you. I had met the dean informally before and went up to see him, although I had not had psychology. He gave me research assistantship in psychology, much to the surprise probably of the psychology faculty. Scott was very good to me, and that's the reason I got my first contacts with this. Of course, at that time, the music department was through Scott. He was playing first clarinet in the University Symphony. He asked me one night to come over. They were working on Messiah, and they needed another clarinet player. Well, I was working at the quad at night, which made it a little awkward, and washing aluminum trays or scrubbing them with steel wool. But I came over and got in the orchestra. That's how I met the people in the music school. Well, after a while, the conductor, Frank Estes Kendry, gave me the job of setting up chairs for the orchestra, so that was
You
one
graduated
source of,
up a little.
Yes, so I became chairman very early, you see. Well, as things went on and on, that's the way, and I don't know, about 19, I guess, 30. Well, when I had the assistantship with Dean Seashore for 1 year, the next year he asked, Dr. Clapp asked if he wouldn't be willing to split it with him, so I could have half of my quarter in music and half in psychology. And the dean agreed. And then little by little, my appointments in music got larger. So in due course, Dr. Clapp asked if I'd like to be a full-time member of the faculty. And at the same time, I had some offers from Davenport. I had been going to Davenport and teaching there on Fridays and Saturdays for the schools and playing in the symphony. I played in the symphony, I think, for 17 years. Now the Quad City, but now it is the Quad City now. It was the Tri-City Symphony then, of course. So little by little, you see.
You were inching across
Yes,
the river
yes.
into the music department.
Yes.
At about the same time you were teaching at City High, did you meet your wife, who was
Yes.
also a teacher?
Yes, she came in 1934, the summer of 1934, to teach strings. And I met her some occasion. I can't even remember the occasion. But I became interested in her, as you can imagine. And I was surprised at her interest in me, but there was one. So
And her instrument
was the violin.
was the violin.
Yes.
Well, tell me, when did you start, besides the teaching, and when did you get this interest in finding music for woodwind instruments that that nationally people all over the United States and probably the world are playing out of your music that you've had published and compiled?
Well, you mentioned Charlie Ebel. Charlie had an indirect part in it. Charlie was Dr. Clapp's secretary for a number of years in the music office. And as a matter of fact, he took some clarinet lessons from me, although he was a pianist, but he did study clarinet at least 1 year that I remember. He found, or we found, a source in Europe where we could get the music more cheaply than you could in this country, and faster. So he started ordering, and that way he became acquainted with music stores over there. And I became interested because my teacher, Mr. Gower, used to write out early lessons for his students. It just lasted about 12 weeks. And I don't know, sometime in the 1930s, I suggested to him, why don't we, in that time, add enough to that to make a year's study? So I gathered a lot of material, and he did too. We finally put out an elementary clarinet method. And that was fairly successful, and we then added another one, a more advanced book. In order to get material for this book, and the publisher asked if we wouldn't be willing to do it for the other instruments too, so I started going to Europe looking for music. And in the course of years, a couple of publishers became interested in what I was doing, asked me to make searches. They'd draw up lists of material they were looking for. And
Searches, excuse me, here or abroad?
abroad.
Abroad.
Yes. So I don't know, Lois and I probably made 15 or 20 visits in Europe. And
Was this in the summer?
yes, when school was out generally. Yeah. Although I did have one semester sabbatical in 1972. But I would just travel to the different cities and work in the libraries.
Do you feel like a musical sleuth?
Well, yes, in a way. It was always exciting, you know, to put your hands on a piece of music that probably been lying there for, 200 years, no one being particularly interested in it. And of course, there was a big boom in music and publishing, and so there was a market for those things.
Who is your publisher at that time?
The original publisher was Jenkins. That was the elementary book. But
Out of Kansas City?
Yes. But Rubank in Chicago was the one I went to with the advanced series of methods, and they published the methods and also books, trios, quartets, and that sort of thing. Then a publisher in London, Music Aurora, drew up some big lists of things they would like to find. I went to Czechoslovakia a number of times, and Hungary and France here and there. Sometimes I'd go through, of course, I also looked at a lot of library cards. You can't get the music that fast to look at. So I looked at hundreds of thousands of library cards. If I'd see something that I was interested in, then I'd go to that library. See, there is a central place in Germany, or more than one now, that asked all the libraries of the world to send in their cards for music published before 1800. But it was just cards, so you could go to this place and look on the card and find, supposedly, what library had it. So I would then go to that library and look for it, and so on.
And you'd bring it back to?
I would bring it back and have it, the zone microfilm, I would get it, and then blow up the microfilm and start to work.
And now students are playing these pieces.
That's right.
All over the United States, aren't
Yes.
they? Was there just not much music for woodwind solos when you started this?
Well, it was the early music. I was primarily interested in the early music, although in the course of going through the cards you find other things. But there was not a great deal of, for certain instruments, clarinet in particular, and even other instruments, oboe, bassoon, is very few, especially published in this country. So it was, I think, a contribution at least to that need, I think.
Tell me, how did you, with your performing and your teaching, what made you decide to become an administrator?
Well, I didn't, it was not anything I had the slightest notion I would ever pursue, and didn't intend to pursue it. But Dr. Clapp, in his late years, was not very well at times. And we'd become good friends, and after World War II, there were lots of, I thought, or many people thought, some deficiencies in the department. We had a flood of students who wanted more courses, this, that, and the other. And he was very good. If I made a suggestion, we ought to require piano or something, okay, go ahead, and so on. So, he did turn over that kind of thing to me. But he was not real well in his later years, and would ask me to help when I could. So little by little, I got into it, and we had a very close relationship. And I was not after his job. He knew that. And I had no intention or any thought of ever succeeding him, to be honest with you. But that's the way it worked out.
So what do you think your greatest strengths as an administrator were?
Well, I think the greatest strength is to hire the right people. And we were very fortunate. Some of the people, of course, people like John Sims and well, Eldon Obrecht, people. We had very good faculty, Harold Stark, of course. There were a bunch of us who were about the same age. We'd kind of moved up about the same way, and I think there was a very strong feeling of what people call collegiality, or whatever you want to call it, because of the fact that, and a number of us, of course, were from Iowa or the Midwest. We had a similar outlook. We were all greatly influenced by Dr. Clapp with his emphasis on performance. And I don't know, I didn't worry. I didn't pound the desk or anything. People seemed to accept my judgments without too much profanity.
Good. Well, tell me, I was going to ask you over your years of who's made a difference in your life or who's influenced you. Is Clapp one of those people?
Oh, yes, I would certainly. No question about it. Clapp, as you know or have heard, after all, you were around when he was around. He was not always the easiest man to get along with, but I must say that in all the years of our relationships, and I had some difficult things to do, to go tell him that I was going to do this or that, but he never said an unkind word to me. And as a musician, of course, he was a superb musician. Yes, he was certainly a great influence. And of course, my teacher, Mr. Gower, was wonderful.
And he came from Centerville,
yes,
for some people who are new to Iowa City.
Yes, he came. He was a town band director and taught in the high school in Centerville. And then Lloyd Swartley was the supervisor of music in Iowa City. And Lloyd left in 1939 to go to Duluth as supervisor. And Mr. Gower came up and taught the band in City High. And he was a very successful teacher. Although he himself was a brass teacher, he nevertheless did excellent work and had wonderful brass students, as well as, of course, a number of very good woodwind students. So Dr. Clapp knew of his work and brought him over to teach brass. He was the first full-time brass teacher in the university, as I was the first time woodwind teacher.
Has teaching changed over the years, do you think, greatly? Since you started out teaching back there in City High, those young whippersnappers.
Teaching has changed. All you need to do is read the papers. You know. The problems teachers face, they've always, of course, faced most of them, but whether they're more acute today, that's a little hard to say. Teachers perhaps want more autonomy than they had in those days. Of course, I taught under Ivor Opstadt, by the way, who also had some influence on me, too. He was a remarkable man and a wonderful administrator. I learned a lot from him about not making too many rules.
Aren't the classes a little bit bigger, though, now? Or was there more individual instruction when you started out?
I think the main thing, if I can believe the papers, but I'm sure it's not true, I think teachers were more demanding of students. That I feel that way. I don't have the statistics, but I think a lot of other people feel that way, rightfully or wrongfully, I don't know. No, I think it was, and I think they probably had more respect than they may have today, I don't know. Certainly they did in small towns, like in Centerville. Centerville had a very mixed group of nationalities. It was a very unusual town, you know, with Italians, Jews, Swedes. We even had a couple of Syrians. And we had several people, Yugoslavs and so on. They had a very high respect for education, which meant that they observed what their children were doing.
And were demanding.
Yes, and we didn't have TV, there's no question. Fond as I am of TV, in that respect, I think it's been an unfortunate thing, but it depends on parents. Some parents are sensible about it, takes care.
Speaking of children, tell me, you have 2 sons. Tell me where they are and what they're about.
Well, Bill, the older son, is a professor of mathematics at the University of Idaho in Moscow. And he still plays. He was quite a fine clarinet player. He still plays a great deal. He was also quite a tennis player. If I may brag, he was also a high school valedictorian. And graduated at the top of his liberal arts class as the male highest graduate. Some girl beat him out.
Congratulations.
Yes. But he's been at Idaho a number of years. Of late, he's gotten into photography a great deal. In fact, the gallery here on Pedestrian Mall had an exhibit of his works last fall, not this fall, last fall. He has a lot of outside interests in community affairs and so on, promoting music and so on. Jim graduated from law school. I should say Bill got his Ph.D. here. Jim graduated from law school at Madison and has been working for State Farm ever since.
So how did you balance your administrating and your performing? Because I hear you're an incredibly fine clarinetist.
No,
that's what the word is.
That's,
so you had administrating, you were teaching, and you were performing.
Well, I was busy, let's say that. But, you know, in terms of administrations, I say we had very good people. It wasn't a constant worry. We had rather a remarkable continuity. The average turnover was, I'm not even sure it was one, maybe it was 1.5. But, you know, nowadays it seems like jobs, until recently when jobs became tighter, jobs seem to be kind of a port of call. You come here and work 3 years and move on. But our faculty wasn't that way. Most of them taught for a long, long time, which made that part easier. My own writing, that sort of thing, was generally done during vacations. We used to go up north in Minnesota woods, and I'd spend the morning writing and reading, and the afternoon or walking trails or something. I don't know, I was busy, but I never felt I was overly so.
Are you still hunting for, are you still on the quest for music?
To a limited degree, yes. My library has been rather useful for our graduate students, and I do help some of those, you know, not officially, but unofficially with dissertations and that sort of thing, providing music for them, that sort of thing.
So how have you liked retirement? What's been the best thing about retirement?
Well, the best thing is there are fewer times when you have to be at a certain place at a certain time. So that's been very valuable. The only thing I haven't liked about it, and that surprised me, is I seem to be busier than I was when I was teaching, which I can't quite figure that out. I think I get up earlier than I used to. But, you know, there are so many things to do, and it's hard to be bored in Iowa City, I think.
True.
You know, although there are people who claim they are and sometimes move on. But it's been a very good thing. I can do more reading than I used to do.
Are you playing at all?
I play in the town band, yes. And that's nice during the summer. It gives me some incentive for practicing, yes. No, I enjoy practicing. I don't care if I necessarily play with anyone else or not. I just like to practice. I think it's a good exercise for my lungs, and fingers. And so far, I'm not arthritic, so I still have my teeth. So.
And you do well. And didn't you, as a child, have asthma, and your mother thought it was not a good idea?
Well, she wasn't sure, and she asked our doctor, and he said, well, there's no harm in it, and you can try it. But oddly enough, the asthma disappeared when I started playing. But we also moved from one house to another at that time, so I often wondered if there wasn't something about the house that caused the allergy. It was quite severe. I dreaded the winters.
But look at you now. Yeah. You can play and no asthma and enjoying retirement. Thank you for being my guest. I loved having you here.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.
My guest on One of a Kind has been Himie Voxman. Professor Voxman enjoys a national reputation as a musical arranger, compiler, composer of nearly 300 works and method books. Professor Voxman is a man of many talents, a clarinetist, teacher, researcher, administrator, author, and arranger. He's received innumerable awards and citations, served on boards and chaired associations. He received 2 distinguished awards from the Iowa Music Educators Association and the University of Iowa. He holds an honorary degree of Doctor of Music from Coe College and a Doctor of Humane Letters from DePaul University. Professor Voxman received a first-place award in 1991 given by the National Federation, Interscholastic Music Associations. He is known for his unique sense of humor and wide range of interests. Charlie Ebel, a well-known Iowa Citian and colleague of Professor Voxman, told me that Himie Voxman is one of the finest clarinet players he has heard. His illustrious career at Iowa has spanned much of the 20th century. Himie Voxman, one of a kind.